Hello and welcome back for another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today's video is a special one as we're counting down the top 10 champions from all of Set 6. What champion stood out the most in terms of consistency across both Gizmos and Gadgets and Neon Knights? Which champions are the most memorable for either half of the set? We'll be answering those questions with our top 10, but keep in mind that there are a lot of champions to consider, so no list is going to cover everything. We'll do our best to make it the most definitive top 10 we can, but afterwards there will be additional honorable mentions to make sure we cover the whole scope of the set. With all that said, let's stop rambling and get to counting down, beginning with the number 10 champion, Shaco. Bear with us as we go back in time to Gizmos and Gadgets, where a certain clown assassin caused a lot of headaches and heartaches. Well, sort of. Shaco may not be the first champion anyone thinks about when looking back on Set 6, but he did have an impact on the meta throughout Gizmos and Gadgets. Plus, when he was removed going into the mid-set, his removal was quite noticeable. Basically, the reason Shaco is here over any other assassin is consistency as an assassin carry. Katarina was a flash-in-the-pan reroll comp, Talon only noteworthy in Neon Knights, and Akali was usually overshadowed by Shaco himself. Kha'Zix is the most likely candidate to overthrow Shaco, but even then, Kha'Zix struggled to be relevant throughout most of the mid-set. Point being, Shaco was the most influential assassin of the set, both in terms of his consistency, but also what the mid-set lacked when he was removed. Three-cost assassins may be frustrating to play against, but they help keep the assassin synergy relevant, and Shaco was the key to that. We don't think most people will remember Shaco as a memorable champion, but that's not the goal here. We're strictly talking about impact on the meta, his role as a three-cost assassin carry, and how much his removal affected assassins and Neon Knights. Up next is a slightly more memorable champion, coming in at number 9, Vex. Yordles were an interesting synergy for Set 6 because they were designed with the intent to be rerolled and ended up just being an early game economy trait. There wasn't a whole lot of staying power for the synergy in champions outside of a few reroll boards like Heimerdinger, Tristana, and Corki. Even then, those boards weren't popular beyond 1 or 2 patches. The question then is, were any Yordles actually memorable as well as impactful on the meta? The answer is a definitive yes because of Vex. While other Yordles struggled to find a place in the meta beyond Stage 2, Vex always managed to be relevant simply because she was a solid frontliner for the mid-game. Vex was also instrumental in helping Orianna stay relevant because without Vex, Orianna severely lacked a frontline. While her design was simple, Vex had a scaling shield with the Orianna trait, so she was amazing at stalling even though she lacked CC. Being a 3-cost Yordle also meant she was great to find when running early game Yordles for economy. Overall, Vex was an important champion for the whole of Set 6 because she filled a role as a frontliner for the early and mid-game for a whole bunch of comps, but most notably, Arcanists. Let's move on to the champion coming in at number 8, Ekko. There he is, the boy savior himself, Ekko. Of course we had to put Ekko on the list. In terms of low-cost units, Ekko was by far the best of them all for Set 6. Ekko's design and synergies were the perfect blend of utility and viability because this champion had their hand in a lot of compositions throughout Set 6, whether that was Scrap, Assassins, Innovators, or plenty of other boards. We will say that Ekko had a more definitive impact on the meta in the mid-set due to the addition of the Innovator tag. It just added so much to the synergy having Ekko since he also had Scrap as a trait which helped him bind the two synergies together. Of course he had value in Gizmos and Gadgets because Scrap Assassin was still plenty good, but being given Innovator truly elevated him. There's not much else to say about Ekko that hasn't already been said previously. By far, he was the most influential 3-cost of the whole set and will definitely be remembered. That's it for low-cost champions because, to be honest, none of the 1-cost units were all that essential for Set 6. There were a few 2-cost champions mentioned later, but for now, let's get into 4 and 5-cost champions, beginning with the number 7 champion, Mundo. Remember Mundo, the champion that does as he pleases? That's right, the triple trait beefy lad himself is in the top 10, and that may be surprising for some, but keep in mind, we're not just including champions that were in both sets. Mundo was the glue between Mutant, Bruiser, and Chemtech in Gizmos and Gadgets, which is why we had to put him on the list. While other mutant champions may come to mind first, the fact is none of them were essential the same way Mundo was, and when Mundo was removed from the mid-set, that left a fairly large gap. It meant Chemtech and Mutants were more often separated than together, and Bruiser had to choose between one or the other. As far as the meta itself, when Mundo was around, he played an essential role as a frontliner. But we can't understate how crucial Mundo was in the meta simply because he was a 4-cost champion with 3 synergies. Triple trait champions almost always have more inherent value because they glue together various traits to form multiple comps. Mundo was that glue and also had a really good champion design with decent damage and a lot of defensive stats. All in all, Mundo had a lot going for him, and that made him so important in the meta. 3 synergies, a great frontliner, and his removal in the mid-set was extremely noticeable. Like some other champions on our list, he may not be all that memorable in the long term, but he still had a crucial impact on the meta nonetheless. Time for a comfort pick as Braum is here as the number 6 champion. No surprises here that Braum is in our top 10 considering how ubiquitous he was in the meta across both halves of the set. There are certainly other frontliners that contested this spot such as Sion, Leona, and Galio, but none of them quite reached the same value and consistency as Braum did throughout set 6. Braum was simply the best of the best for the frontline with a well-designed CC ultimate and plenty of defensive stats from his synergy and being a 4-cost. Braum wasn't flashy and certainly never won games on his own, but he was the foundation for a lot of compositions in set 6 and should be looked upon in future sets for his design. We're already seeing that impact in set 7 with champions like Ornn and Hecarim that mimic the same type of frontline design that Braum had. Hats off to you, Braum. You will be missed. Next up, we have Tahm Kench not being on the bench and instead taking our number 5 spot on the list. Look, we had to put Tahm Kench in our top 10 simply because he had such a unique design. Players being able to feed Tahm Kench with a glutton trait to increase his stats is such a memorable design choice. Not only was it an interesting mechanic, it also gave players agency because they could choose which stat they gave him based on what was needed for that specific lobby. We do have to point out that Tahm Kench was certainly not that important to the meta, though he definitely had his time in the sun multiple times across both sets. But as far as champions players will look back on and remember, Tahm Kench is certainly going to be near the top. For that alone, he deserves a spot in our top 10. Back to the meta-impactful champions, we have Jayce coming in at number 4. Overall, the 5-cost champions of set 6 weren't that great. Oh, they definitely had unique designs and legendary boards were certainly a thing, but by and large, most of the metas were defined by 4-cost units, not 5 costs. Jayce, on the other hand, broke that mold throughout most of the set. There's 2 main reasons for that. One, the Transformer trait meant Jayce could be played in the front or back, carry, or utility. This gave him a lot of versatility that other 5 costs lacked. Secondly, he was an innovator. Innovator was by far the most impactful synergy of the set, and Jayce was a crucial piece for that synergy, especially whenever 7 Innovator ruled that meta. We definitely don't think Jayce will stand out in players' memories when looking back on the set because there are more memorable champions, including other 5 costs. But his consistency in the meta definitely places him near the top of the most important units of the set. Now we're into the champions that really stand out. Coming in at number 3, we have Yone. When thinking back on the most overall consistent champion of Gizmos and Gadgets, there are a few notable candidates. Fiora, Urgot, Mundo, Sion, and a few others come to mind, but none of them were quite on the same level as Yone. Yone was the carry of the set and overshadowed most of them, with the exception of Fiora and Urgot, who weren't too far behind him as carries. Point is, Yone will be remembered as the defining champion of Gizmos and Gadgets because he thrived in almost every meta as a melee carry. 2 stat boosting synergies and a well-designed ability put him at the forefront of most metas. But there was another champion that will be remembered even more, and that's our number 2 champion, Sivir. Sivir was to Neon Knights what Yone was to Gizmos and Gadgets, but unlike Yone, no other carry came close to Sivir in that half of the set. Oh sure, Aurelia had her moments, but what other champion will be remembered as the carry of the set? Jhin? Draven? Ahri? Doubtful. None of them stood out, and none of them were as dominant for basically the whole half of the set as Sivir. Recency bias may play a role here, but it really doesn't matter which of these 2 champions is second or third on the list. Point is, they were both the defining carries of their respective halves of the set. Sivir gets the advantage because Neon Knights was mostly devoid of impactful, interesting carries, whereas Yone at least had Urgot and Fiora following close behind him. In any case, both Yone and Sivir will certainly be remembered as key champions of set 6. The most impactful champion, though, is our number 1 champion, Orianna. Orianna may not stand out as flashy or unique, but by golly was she consistent. Both halves of the set, Orianna was the queen of utility and had parts in tons of different meta compositions. Clockwork and Enchanter as her traits just meant Orianna could be splashed in super easily when necessary. On top of that, her ability was amazing because it had CC, shields, and did decent damage. We will say that Orianna probably won't be thought of first when looking back on the set. That's okay though, because it just means that she did such a good job at being consistently present and valuable that she's taken the number 1 spot over other champions. As far as utility splash champion design goes, Orianna was certainly one of the best for TFT. Alright folks, that wraps it up for our top 10 champions for all of set 6. Before we go, we've got a few rapid fire honorable mentions to cover, or less so honorable and more memorable. First off is a mention to the 2-cost reroll champions. Those are Warwick, Talon, Katarina, and Kog'Maw. While low-cost units were mostly mad this set, these 4 stood out in specific metas when their reroll boards dominated. Next, Seraphine deserves a shout out for always being a consistent 4-cost utility champion, as well as her 2 traits, Socialite and Innovator. She didn't stand out much, but Seraphine definitely filled an important role in the meta. The Arcanist carries have to be mentioned with Lux, Ahri, and Victor. Fortunately, they just didn't leave much of an impact on the set. Victor is definitely the highlight of these 3, and Ahri will be remembered for missing orbs, but we can't have a champions list without mentioning the Arcanists. Moving on are all the secondary mutants, Kai'Sa, Malzahar, and Kha'Zix. Problem is that all these champions are overshadowed by the mutations. Synaptic Web, Voracious, Cybernetic, Bioleeching were all mutations that these champions had a role in, but again, the mutations will stand out more than the champions. The exception is Kai'Sa, but there were too many metas where she was absent. Chemtech deserves a bit of attention, as Renata definitely played an important role in Neon Knights. Unfortunately, she lacked consistency, much like Lissandra from Gizmos and Gadgets. Renata will likely be remembered more as her ability was unique. And to end with, we have Yuumi and Silco, which need to be mentioned because both of them were solid 5-cost splash champions for their halves of the set. Yuumi will probably be remembered less than Silco simply because Silco was the first unique champion of TFT. That alone will put him at the forefront of people's memories, though his actual impact on the meta was inconsistent. That said, both Yuumi and Silco were solid champions of the set. There are so many champions we could continue talking about, but we'll end it here, folks. Overall, Set 6 had a diverse cast of champions. Gizmos and Gadgets definitely felt more unique and interesting, whereas champions introduced in Neon Knights were, in general, less interesting. That said, the set as a whole had a lot of memorable units and was definitely a success. Remember to check out the Giant Slayer TFT socials in the description below to keep up to date with any news, shows, and other content. Thank you for watching. If you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Future Giant Slayer TFT videos.